Let's go back in time a bit to the ancient civilizations. Generally speaking, how did gender roles work strictly in relation to marriage? Naturally and objectively, women were seen as a necessary asset to maintain the species, in other words, a reproductive asset. For men in ancient societies, marriage was seen as an enterprise, since it meant taking on a fixed cost, not just for the survival of the lineage, but also to expand the power of the clan. This is usually where the feminist discourse of oppression comes in, since in the patriarchy, women were considered reproductive objects, and they ignore the exchange relationships that this kind of enterprise involved. In this way, the family was structured so that there was a patriarch, the primary source of resources, the one who had contributed the most initial family capital, and the woman who would bring reproductive capital. The man took on more risks since he provided the family's initial capital in the short term. In other words, he would work to accumulate resources and be ready to start a family. Meanwhile, the woman contributed long-term capital, since she would pay her share by giving this man children who would later become a source of resources for the family. In other words, the man would need to provide resources and protection for quite some time before seeing a return on his investment, which would be the children, a workforce for the family business. This marriage arrangement made it possible for families to join together and also promoted the extended family, leading to wealth and prosperity for everyone. The woman, being the more vulnerable party, became perpetually dependent on her husband, and because of this, there was a sort of debt in the family exchange. In other words, an obligation for the woman to have access to her husband's resources. In sexual matters, women were introduced to marriage at a very young age, and menstruation determined when a girl was ready to debut. This gave the husband total responsibility for her education, behavior, and character. Thus, the woman acknowledged the husband's leadership and authority, and the husband shaped the woman through instruction. It was a time without junk food or processed foods, so a woman's beauty and health lasted longer. Life expectancy was 50 years, and 10 to 20% of the male population was being maimed in wars, so the female population was much larger. Because of this, there was an understanding among women who were fortunate, since a woman who didn't get married would have to find a way to support herself. In the family hierarchy, the woman was below the husband, and therefore had less responsibility because of the authority relationship. If a woman committed a sin, she would be sinning against her husband, and he would punish her for it. No-fault divorce didn't exist, so a woman couldn't leave a husband just because of boredom. There are no historical records of romance or declarations of love. Up until then, marriage was an enterprise, a business for the family, carried out in a modest and private way, without any extravagant display of consumption. Up to this point, we see that there isn't a clear hypergamous influence at an epidemic level, as we'll see later on. That's why my investigation will begin at the psychological level, a theory of how neurobiological aspects influence the downfall of patriarchy and result in a gynocentric society. Look, feminism, traditionalism, all of that is just a symptom of a disorder in what is natural, the roles of men, women, and the family. But I also can't ignore that ideologies can be used as a tool of social engineering to promote appropriate behavior, with the expected collective outcome. As long as they're treated as trigger tools that simply awaken a mental pattern that's already deeply programmed in the person's mind, vectorial investigation needs to be done from the inside out and determine the boundary where it begins. The collective consciousness will influence the individual's behavior from the outside in. As a starting point, we need to establish that human beings have a set of standard programs passed down through the genetic chain. These are pieces of information from our ancestors that we carry in our DNA, and this determines our species. Neuroscience will affirm that basic psychological programming is also passed down. It is through this genesis and the learning process that personality is built. It's like buying a computer with only Windows installed, without any additional applications. And over time, you start installing programs on it to optimize the daily tasks that need to be done. Well, in this basic human software, some primitive behaviors are already installed. For men, it's dominance. For women, it's hypergamy. These two factors are what allow nature to carry out natural selection within the human species, because our intelligence surpassed that of other species, putting us at the top of the food chain. This means that man would be man's own predator. Think about how many millions of years this genetic information has been passed down from generation to generation until we reach civilized man. Can you see how much this genetic information has been reinforced over hundreds of thousands of years? All the way up to the great ancient empires? Dominance is a primitive behavior. It's the result of this programming. In other words, it's a genetic inheritance. A lesson passed down through the ages, stored in the very DNA, male. While hypergamy drives women to seek resources in men, dominance pushes men to compete with other men in order to acquire resources and achieve reproductive success. This is one of the reasons why men generally don't feel empathy for a random man. When he sees some guy complaining about something, he doesn't think, here's a brother, or that could be me, so let's listen to him, let's help him out. Men usually don't feel that empathy because of the ongoing competition driven by dominance. And even if he's not consciously thinking about it, his brain will guide his actions. A man can only overcome this instinct and work together with other men when they have a greater purpose, a strong sense of compassion, whether it's due to a philosophical, moral, religious ethic, etc. That doesn't mean he'll be immune to dominance impulses, but it's likely he'll channel those impulses toward a life purpose. There's a modern anthropological idea that dominance is part of a historical and social context. I tend to believe more in the biological evidence that ends up being reflected in the social environment. In other words, biological factors influence behavior, which in turn influences the social environment. Man, in his primitive aspect, exercised dominance guided by the basic functions still stored in his older mind, made up of the basal brain and limbic system, as discussed in Triune Brain and Evolution by neurologist Paul G. MacLean. The development of the neocortex, or rational brain, was a huge leap in the evolutionary process, and it's what sets us apart from other animals. And according to MacLean, it is only because of the presence of the neocortex that humans are able to develop abstract thinking and have the capacity to create inventions. The rational mind also acts as a filter for new ideas that are presented to us. It's like a brake on our primitive impulses. For example, when someone gets drunk, it lowers the influence of this filter and the person might lose their inhibitions, frontal lobe, limbic system, or have trouble processing visual information, occipital lobe, or experience mental confusion, parietal lobe, and so on. In other words, this brake on common sense is connected to this evolutionary development. From there, humans began to recognize their deepest impulses and developed ways of thinking to control those instincts, defining what was right and wrong, and establishing a moral code to guide their lives. A code by which they could measure themselves and their principles. And from these base instincts of dominance, higher values of dominance also emerged. Before, violence was used to mate with females or for territory. Now, man could only use justified violence, aligned with justice and the rules he himself created. In this way, courage, which is basically the disregard for death and pain, was a trait every man was expected to have, especially in ancient Rome, where the concept of virtus was what set a noble man apart from a weak one. We can see that today there is no real inheritance from Roman culture. Glory, whether in battle or for doing something great for your country, has conveniently been replaced by the bravery of building resources to share with your wife. They say, don't be a coward, putting the kind of courage the Romans talked about on the same level as mere social validation, which dictates that a successful man is a married man. Other cardinal virtues, such as justice, prudence, and self-control, also align with the Greek concept of arete, which is the excellence of a purposeful life, using all of your potential. For those who started a family in Rome, there was a title, pater familias. The wife, children, financial resources, possessions, material goods, everything was potesta, a right acquired by the man as the authority of the family. The feminine virtues in ancient Rome were modesty and charity. It is concluded that the dominance or primitive behavior of man as an inferior species was controlled and tamed by the superior man and encouraged or rather strictly demanded of other men to follow such conduct, elevating man's behavior and his morals and earning the respect of society itself. And by behaving this way, he was rewarded. Society was already more lenient with women, since what was expected of them was modesty and charity in order to be considered virtuous, what they called pudicia, a word we inherited in our language as pudica, modest. Notice that in Roman society, gender roles were very clearly defined in terms of both biological and psychological differences. All of this was taken into account in the construction of their culture. Because of this, civic responsibilities were demanded of men, not women, who answered to their husbands, since they were under their authority. This culture was not passed down to us as an inheritance, because for people today, this kind of relationship was far too extreme, too backward. This culture was completely subverted after the fall of the Roman Empire, and in the medieval era, a different kind of behavior began to emerge: romantic love. Ancient Rome was not traditionalist, it was patriarchal, which is very different from medieval traditionalism. It's important to make this distinction here, because it's very common for people to confuse the meanings of things. When these civilizations fell into disgrace and came to an end, the patriarchy had already been eliminated, and female empowerment was extremely evident in the laws and customs. Today, in Brazil, most people are traditionalists. And that is nothing like the social arrangements of the patriarchy in ancient Rome. Even though traditionalists claim that our culture is based on that, it's nothing but a fallacy meant to evoke a sense of legitimacy in their fight to defend failed traditionalism. I don't see even a shadow, a hint, not even a single hair of ancient Rome or Greece here in Brazil. I have to laugh when people say we've inherited some culture from ancient Europe. Not even Europe has kept the cultural heritage of its own past, and soon it won't have any genetic heritage either. When it comes to social and cultural relations between men and women today, what we've really inherited came from the decline of the Roman Empire. At the end of antiquity, restructuring itself in the early Middle Ages and becoming solidified during the feudal period. It's here that we find the first traces of the traditional concept of manliness and machismo, masculine qualities that were already completely distorted from those of ancient Rome, since the barbarian invasions wiped out any remnants of Roman culture. In another video, I'll talk more in depth about how patriarchy builds civilizations and how gynocentrism destroys them. I believe that the roots of gynocentrism are found in man's very nature, in what I call pathological indulgence, which is an unconscious tendency in men toward trust, leniency, and pity for women in general, while having no empathy for other men. While the dominance of the rational man drives him toward achievements in the building of a superior character, the primitive man, coming from his deeper and older mind, comes into conflict with reason. You see, the triune brain theory lays out some mental rules that I need to consider in my analysis. To make things clearer, I need to name the three minds in a more familiar way, so it's easier to understand. Our mind is divided into the unconscious, the subconscious, and the conscious. For teaching purposes, I'll use these terms. As I mentioned before, the basal brain or reptilian brain corresponds to the unconscious, the limbic brain to the subconscious, and the neocortex to the conscious. Imagine they're like three brothers. The unconscious is the oldest, the subconscious is the middle brother, and the conscious is the youngest. Despite their interdependence, the three minds operate in a hierarchical way, So no matter how rational you think you are, your emotional brain will always have the final say. The emotional mind, or subconscious, which here also includes the unconscious, is what guided us throughout our entire evolutionary process, and its main function was our self-preservation, and that also includes reproduction. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens sapiens, after the awakening of new cognition, or the neocortex, that was the time when we started to justify our emotions and label those emotions with what we now call feelings. But then, what is emotion? Emotion is the body's reaction. For example, when we're anxious, we feel a tightness in our chest. Anxiety is the feeling. The tightness in the chest is the emotion. Now, why would we feel anxious? This is the moment when the rational brain will justify it, analyzing the obvious data and presenting a result. So that's how the subconscious-conscious relationship works. There's an emotional pattern installed in your subconscious, and it has a trigger. When it's activated, the body feels the stimulus and reacts, and the rational mind justifies that emotion. With this flow explained, now you understand why you made a decision that, to anyone else, seemed stupid. But to you, it made sense? Now let's look at an example. A smoker usually says they smoke because it relaxes them. Come on, isn't he fully aware that cigarettes are bad for his lungs, contain more than 4,000 toxic substances, harm his physical performance, smell bad, bother other people, among other harms? Are you sure he knew all that even before he became a smoker? That's printed on every poster, even on the packs themselves. So why the heck does he start smoking? He says it's to relax, that it helps him think, that it helps him unwind after a stressful day. That's the conscious mind coming up with a justification for an emotional need he doesn't understand, because emotion is something illogical. The subconscious mind has a strictly emotional language, so it can't communicate with the conscious mind on the same wavelength. So the rational mind just makes something up. More details in the video, The Engineering of the Mind, which I'll be re-releasing here, because I don't want to go too deep into such a complex topic. But this simplified explanation I gave is, according to neuroscience, which I'm really passionate about, accurate. Because of sexual dimorphism, which makes women physically more fragile than men, women, in turn, developed a self-preservation practice that's embedded in their genetic inheritance. Just as men have dominance, women have hypergamy. So, every man is born with dominance, and every woman is born with hypergamy, like a factory setting programmed into their subconscious. And that can't be changed. You can customize it, install other apps, change some outcomes, but you can't change the nature of the software. As inferior human beings, both men and women were guided exclusively by this programming. But when the awakening of rational consciousness happened, man set out to tame his baser instincts, whether through a moral law, a divine law, or a philosophical ethic. And he basically did this because of behavioral aspects that come from dominance. The pack consciousness, which in Homo sapiens was passed on as a sense of tribe or community. This is what makes man preserve what he has built and think long term. Women, on the other hand, by benefiting from the primitive assistance provided by the males in the tribe, didn't need to make as much effort as men did. That's how it was before Homo sapiens, and after the evolution to the rational species, their hypergamy simply adapted to the new conditions. The position women were in was comfortable for them. She just needed to choose a good male and then live off his provisions. And to achieve that, she needed to be a good emotional manipulator. Even though the species' genetics are the same, there's a clear difference in the two evolutionary paths that determined analogous yet different behaviors. Because of dominance, men generate more resources in order to gain greater reproductive power. And female hypergamy makes women seek out these resources in men. A woman can almost unconsciously spot the emotional gaps that a man has. And the emotional gap she manipulates is vanity or ego, whichever you prefer. The ego is a rational perception we have of an emotional pattern. Since the rational mind doesn't understand the language of the emotional brain, it creates justifications that are really just shadows of an emotional need. That's why the ego is just a mask for the real cause behind our behavior. Most people can't give a clear explanation for why they behave a certain way, so they make something up because they lack self-awareness. The more beautiful a woman is, the greater the sign of her purity. And the more purity, the more legitimacy her offspring have. It's as if the sower found the best soil to plant his seeds with the certainty that the fruits will be pure and beautiful. It doesn't matter how experienced she is. This woman, her beauty is a clear sign sent straight to your emotional brain that she is the perfect woman for mating. Guys, understand this. No matter how much you think humans are some kind of divine beings because of your religious beliefs, here I'm being very scientific in what I'm saying. Human beings are emotional individuals with occasional lapses into rationality. In other words, humans are nothing more than know-it-all chimpanzees, or, if you prefer, pretentious chimps. If you want to understand human nature, you need to keep that in mind. We're not that different from animals. There's nothing special about us. Nature doesn't care at all when it causes a tsunami that wipes everything off the map, from ants to the wisest of men. It doesn't distinguish between beings. It is the law. It just does what needs to be done. So, going back, the rational brain is the perception of external reality, of being. The emotional brain is the internal content of the being, the outer man versus the inner man. I hope I'm managing to keep you with me so far. Indulgence is a pathological trust and complacency that men have toward the opposite sex because of a mechanism that filters this external information and matches it with their internal content. Indulgence is a prodigal child of man's vanity and ego. When a man's vanity is manipulated by the opposite sex, he tends to fulfill the gluttonous desires of women in order to gain access, even if remote or impossible, to the female reproductive system. That's what makes a guy comment on a woman's photo, someone he'll never have a sexual relationship with, like complimenting a model or actress on Instagram. Rationally, he knows she's completely out of reach, but his emotional mind just can't grasp that. For the mind, all it takes is a little impulse. Whatever your emotional mind believes, you believe. When your instinctive brain sends an impulse, it doesn't care whether you'll actually succeed or not. It's just there to act on that stimulus, which, in the example I mentioned, was visual. That's why when you watch an erotic movie, you end up getting aroused, even though you're not actually in the scene yourself. Do you get what I'm trying to say now? So, every demand from an emotional pattern will generate a justification from the rational brain. And if indulgence is the demand of an emotional pattern, then the presumption of a woman's insufficiency or hypermorality is the rational justification. Understand that I'm not saying this is good or bad. It's just the way it is. It's nature. Dominance leads us to generate resources for reproductive purposes, and we give in to the advances of women's desires because of this indulgence, just like we give in to children, since the behavioral effects are the same as what we experience with a child. That's why women act like children when they want something from a man. This childlike simulation in a man's mind enters through the same door, but it accesses other parts of the brain that are more connected to pleasure and reward mechanisms, as I'll explain later. And they know this instinctively. So this is just a hypothetical analysis, but for this essay I needed to defend this idea, because this confidence and complacency isn't a social construct, it's biological, and without it, human females wouldn't have survived natural selection. It's precisely because of this indulgence that, in times of economic prosperity, gynocentrism starts to blossom, as we'll see in the next chapter. A man in love is like an addict who needs his fix all the time, and at that moment his dominance was subdued, not by the woman, but by being a permissive man and giving in to his vanity because of these stimuli. The circuits activated in the brain of someone in love are the same as those in addiction, sending your dopamine levels sky high while lowering your serotonin. That's what users of synthetic drugs call a bad trip. Consuming the drug of passion is like having your dopamine levels sky high, euphoria, reward, and then when the effect wears off, your serotonin drops, bringing sadness and withdrawal. I believe this is a mechanism that nature created to compensate for this sexual dimorphism, and therefore, without these pathological factors, we wouldn't have indulgence, and human females could be eliminated by natural selection. Nature is amoral. It doesn't care about what's right or wrong. It just creates mechanisms to keep the flow of life going. And that's what nature did to create more balance in these relationships between men and women. So, to wrap up this chapter, let's review this flow. The reproductive instinct and the greater male sexual dimorphism compared to women are the biological parameters of dominance. These parameters encourage men to behave somewhat violently and apathetically toward other men, while acting in a completely opposite way with women, generally being empathetic, condescending, and compassionate toward them. These triggers create subconscious learning, developing an emotional pattern that leads to the behavior of pathological indulgence. These patterns are reinforced by life experiences, and when they are rewarded for acting this way, the subconscious creates a repetitive and continuous system. In other words, a habit. A man's ego justifies this behavior as the right thing to do and projects it onto some excuse, whether ideological, like traditionalism and feminism, or hypogamic protectionism, a sexual fetish like cuckoldry and white knighting, or even all of these together within the same package, which is the gynocentric complex. And all of this is what I call pathological indulgence. Now that we understand the psychological causes and have identified the internal vector behind gynocentrism, we can see that men themselves are responsible for it, due to their own looseness and permissiveness driven by vanity. And this permissiveness becomes epidemic during times of economic prosperity or civilizational stability. In this way, the alphas who dominate that civilization start to allow gynocentrism in order to gain more access to reproduction. Now let's move on to the external vector, which are the socio-cultural causes. So let's go back to the feudal period. Now that we've established that indulgence is a pathological and therefore emotional trait in men, and that fighting against it requires a lot of enlightenment, steadfastness, self-knowledge, righteousness, and self-control over base instincts, let's understand the external factors that encourage this behavior, which became a culture known as traditionalism and its twin sister, feminism. There's a well-known saying that goes like this: strong men create easy times, and easy times create weak men, but weak men create hard times, and hard times create strong men. This saying sums up well the teachings of the book The Fate of Empires. It's a historical lesson in just a few words. Our story goes back to Europe in the 12th century, when a kind of early version of the slogan, "Make love, not war," began to emerge. It all started when an artistic movement known as courtly love began to dominate the cultural scene of the time. Due to the multiculturalism of the time, an Arab practice was introduced, a kind of worship of the feminine, which, combined with strong trends in aristocratic courtship, and with Marianism, or Mariolatry if you prefer, which practically elevated women of that era to the status of saints like the Virgin Mary. And all of this being merged with the military code of conduct of the time gave rise to what we know as chivalry. But then you ask me, how the hell did they manage to fit courtly love into the military code of conduct and behavior? Take a guess. It's very simple, traveler. By shaming, or the infamous shaming. Does that ring any bells for you? Sound familiar? Now you're finally going to understand why traditionalists are enemies of men, traitors to their own gender, and why, as MGTOW, we oppose them. It all starts when a crazy capybara with enough financial power and great influence, named Eleanor of Aquitaine, decides to become the protagonist of a cultural revolution that would last to this day. She started funding writers, troubadour musicians, artistic works, and together with Marie de Champagne, presided over a prototype of the family court, known at the time as the Court of Love. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. For teaching purposes, I'm going to use some modern terms to make it clear and easy to understand what was done back then. Knights were the most famous and wealthy men of the time, and when they were accused of any undisciplined behavior, any abuse that could be considered as machismo or toxic masculinity, they were publicly shamed so that their actions would serve as an example and justify a cultural reform in men's behavior. So Marie de Champagne gathered all the aristocratic of the time, from the lowest-ranking soldiers to the princes and what we might call the middle class and the beautiful people, to align with them on what the etiquette for men and women should be. One example of this is that hunting was considered a coarse behavior and was replaced by chivalric games as a way to tame men's inclination toward hunting. Marie had a deep desire to convince the men of society of their flaws, a sort of sorry for being a man, and to prescribe romantic love and, at the same time, the adoration of women as the remedy. Through this manual, romantic love was introduced as part of the conduct of the military code, and thus, as they called it, to tame the brutality and disorder of men. The idea that love is ennobling and necessary for the education of a knight comes from that era. Real men were the best lovers, and consequently the best knights. As an arm of this cultural revolution, there was Marianism or Mariolatry. Although there was a consensus within the church that men and women were equally heirs to sin, basic Christian attitudes toward women began to evolve during this period. At this time, a new veneration of women emerged as a counterpart to the Virgin Mary, along with the rise of chivalry and courtly love, which had the effect of elevating the status of women and weakening the earlier idea that women had inherited original sin. And Mary became the prevailing notion of woman at the time, a kind of Virgin Mary in heaven, woman on earth. After this change, men continued to be seen as sinners seeking redemption, trying to imitate Christ, while women were increasingly viewed as counterparts to the Holy Virgin on earth, pure, perfect from birth, virgins, and with less emphasis on their need for redemption. In other words, after the Middle Ages, less emphasis was placed on women's sinful inheritance from Eve and more on their resemblance to Mary. Even with the Protestant split from Catholicism, the idea of the pure and holy woman, which developed from the veneration of Mary, carried on, but without the Catholic emphasis on Mary herself. While the gynocentric elevation of women took root in the church, its origin came largely from outside, in a complete intersection of pagan beliefs, an Arab cult of women, chivalry, courtly love, heretical Marian sects, especially among the aristocratic classes who stitched these elements together into a popular gynocentric worldview. In the 11th century, the cult of the Virgin Mary became widely popular. The reverence granted to the Virgin was extended to the female sex in general. And just as a vassal owed obedience to his feudal lord, he also owed service and devotion to his lady. Thus, there was a service of love, just as there was a service of vassalage, and the lover stood in relation to his lady in a position analogous to that of the vassal to his sovereign. The aristocracy and the church developed the doctrine of the superiority of women. Such adoration united both the person of the Virgin in heaven and that on earth, and it passed on to the modern world the ideal of chivalry. The cult of the Virgin and the cult of chivalry grew together and continually influenced each other. The cult of the lady was the worldly counterpart to the cult of the Virgin, and was an invention of the medieval aristocracy. In chivalry, the romantic adoration of a woman was just as necessary as the perfect knight's devotion to God. In other words, the worship of a lady was considered almost as important as the worship of God. The arrangement was seg. Now that the power of love had been established, the feminine complaint satisfied, and romantic love was in full swing within the code of chivalry, we start to see the behavior of romantic soldiers looking a lot like what we see today. For example, he'll fight to the death for his lady, write love letters from the front lines, or keep a crumpled photo of his girlfriend in some pocket of his uniform. Instead of fighting for his country or his king, it's his love for her that now drives a man's military sacrifice. Movies that depict wars or adventures always have a hero and his lady stopping for a long kiss, with bombs exploding and buildings collapsing around them, as if to suggest that all that carnage is because of her. A recent example of this is the movie John Wick, Parabellum, which, by the way, I really enjoyed. But at a certain point, someone asks John why he's doing all of this. What keeps him fighting? He answers that it's to keep the memory of his beloved alive. How many movies have we seen about a guy who defies everything and everyone for the sake of avenging his late lady? Like I've said before, feminism is about the inferiority of women, and that's why it wants to diminish and emasculate men, to make them inferior to women so that women can gain an advantage. Traditionalism is about putting women on a pedestal, giving them a status of superiority and holiness, where men aren't even worthy of kissing their feet and should offer up all their possessions and even their own lives to them. Chivalry gives rise to feminism, and feminism can't exist without chivalry. It's a self-sustaining system. Chivalry was never a measure of manliness, in the same way as the Roman virtus or Greek virtue ethics. Never. Before the Middle Ages, declarations of passion between couples were made privately. If they were made in public, they were seen as suspicious. When the age of chivalry arrived, men were forced to make extravagant declarations, pay homage to goddesses in public squares, at jousting tournaments, host lavish romantic events, emasculating a man to such an extent that, just like today's media is YouTube, I see men making video after video declaring their love for their beloved, or giving them space to appear in their videos, and even letting them embarrass them in front of their entire audience. Today, it's accepted for a woman to hit, humiliate, and embarrass a man in public, while he has to treat her like a Disney princess. Look at what a pro-feminism writer, Modesta Pozzo, wrote back in 1590. Don't we see that the proper task of men is to go out to work and wear themselves out trying to accumulate wealth as if they were our butlers, so that we can stay at home like the housekeeper, managing their property and enjoying the profits of their labor? That, if you like, is the reason why men are naturally stronger and more robust than we are. They need to be, so they can handle the hard work in our service. Now, look at what Minister Demare said just now, in December 2018. Today, women have been spending a lot of time outside the home. I always joke about how I'd love to be at home all afternoon, lying in a hammock, while my husband works really, really, really hard to support me and shower me with jewelry and gifts. That would be the ideal standard for society. Can you see the pattern here? Traditionalism fuels feminism. One doesn't exist without the other. Feminism put women out to work and compete with men, but since they can't compete directly with men in the job market, feminism creates public policies to gradually take away men's natural advantages and create artificial advantages for women. At the same time, traditionalism also creates these working conditions for women, but in practice, a woman's money is hers, and a man's money is also hers. That's what being a real man means in traditionalism. Sacrifice for the sake of the lady. And traditional women aren't much different from feminists. I think traditionalist women are even more cowardly than feminists because they pretend to be saints, turn a blind eye to all the messes feminism has made, but still take advantage of every privilege they can get from society. Others yell at and insult feminists, but when it comes to taking away any of their privileges, they throw a tantrum like children. At least feminists are easy to spot. Meanwhile, the traditionalist hides behind a virginal goddess aura and uses feminism as a scapegoat to deflect the sickly stain that feminists carry. They don't want to lose the veneration and sacrifice that men make for their sake. Another practice in sexual feudalism was the court of love. Women love euphemisms. The family court is the woman's stick on the man's back, and the court of love was actually a court of hatred against men. In theory, it was supposed to resolve marital problems, but in practice, it was meant to shame and punish men for not treating the goddess like a goddess. This court of love was made up exclusively of women. It was also known as the Ladies' Court, where Eleanor of Aquitaine, her daughter Marie of Champagne, her niece Isabel of Flanders, and Ermengarde, Countess of Narbonne, presided as judges. And besides that, it was made up of 70 women jurors. What a time to be a knight! You spend years on a crusade, and when you come back, everything's gone to hell. The punishments were varied. They spread the news of their rejection of toxic men through pamphlets, a kind of tabloid of the time. And it's only natural that you compare this to today's mainstream. Being a knight was an honor and a great status in society, earned through a lot of sacrifice and hard work that could be completely destroyed by a single piece of news, like a false accusation in a pamphlet. It could even lead to harsher punishments, like the loss of assets, property, titles. It was horrific. No, sir. A woman's word carried much more weight than that of a knight. A lie from the virgin goddess was worth more than 1,000 truths from a knight. Everything was always analyzed from the female perspective. I mentioned earlier that a civilized man's sense of community has always been a gauge of his morality. If he made a mistake, he would be subject to the very rules he created. As for his wife under his care, her baser instincts were kept in check by her husband. But when the roles were reversed in chivalric traditionalism, the woman lost that restraint, man. It's very rare to see a woman with spiritual values who can reach the same logical conclusions and maintain the same moral conduct as a man, precisely because she never had to do that. They received all the benefits for free, and in ancient civilizations, all that was expected of them was to be chaste and modest. The only woman I've studied, and can confidently say has a high spiritual value for me, is Esther Villar. Only a woman with a truly intellectual background could reach the conclusions she wrote in her books The Manipulated Man, Marriage is Immoral, and Polygamous Sex. I can't imagine many women today who would write books like those. Men's pathological indulgence toward women has removed any restraints that once existed, letting them give in to their lowest narcissistic desires and take perverse actions against men. And this has been established for over 800 years. You really think something like this can be fixed? Do you think the laws are going to get better? Even if they did get better, how would you deconstruct the misandrist culture that's practically rooted in the DNA of the modern man with a traditionalist mindset? Gynocentrism, just like it was during the feudal period, is present in all media, all literature, in every TV commercial, in every show, in the laws, in the judiciary, both in the Catholic and Protestant churches, in music, in holidays, in educational institutions, in everything. The only solution to all this crap is MGTOW, and that's it. Reject all this secular garbage and find a purpose without being a servant to any woman under the excuse of the responsibility of being a man. This was shaming over 800 years ago. A Greek or ancient Roman citizen looking at this today would rather be run through with a sword in war than have to submit to all this just to be considered a real man. MGTOW is the only way in truth for the modern man. And with the fifth wave of feminism, I don't know, man. It's unlikely anything will change in the short or medium term. The fifth wave will fool the unsuspecting, those who are reluctant MGTOWs. They might think things are going to get better and then go back to the plantation, but in reality, the gynocentric system will just take a step back only to come back even stronger. The only solution and option I see for saving society is full-on hardcore patriarchy, but that's just a utopia. What's most likely to happen is a technocracy. There you go, another video that's about to be made for you guys. Anyway, traditionalists and feminists are exactly what a society that wants to be healthy doesn't need. Well, the main behaviors prescribed by the code of chivalric love are performing romantic deeds, acts of bravery, and vassalage. Before there was a shift in romantic relationships, gallantry, or being gallant, referred to any courageous behavior, especially in battle. Like with machismo, I believe the meaning of this word has completely changed. However, regarding the rules of chivalric love, it became, according to the Google Dictionary definition, open quotes, polite attention or respect given by men to women, courteous to ladies, delicately obliging, close quotes. Could these two definitions of gallantry be any further apart? They broaden the meaning to cover two completely different domains of behavior. It seems then that the women of that era successfully took advantage of men's greatest sacrificial behaviors, chivalry and bravery, to satisfy their narcissistic appetites. A vassal is defined as a servant, a slave, a subordinate or dependent, or a person who entered into a mutual obligation with a lord or monarch in the context of the feudal system in medieval Europe. The obligations often included military support and mutual protection in exchange for certain privileges, usually including the granting of land held as a fief. Vassalage in courtly love was then used as a concept that Maurice Valency called the shaping principle of the entire design of courtly love. Whether he was a knight, a troubadour, or a commoner, the routine of being a vassal to the lady was the order of the day, just as it is today. The poets adopted the terminology of feudalism by declaring themselves vassals of the lady and addressing them as middens, which etymologically does not mean my lady, but rather my lord, and was taken as the standard flattery for a woman. A particularly notable practice, showing an adaptation of the feudal model, involved the man kneeling on one knee before the woman. By kneeling in this way, he assumes the posture of a vassal. He speaks, pledging his loyalty, promising as a man to a lord that he will not offer his services to anyone else. And he goes even further. In the manner of a servant, he offers her the gift of his entire self, a mortal being graced by divine love. Even today, we hear these mannerisms coming from the mouths of men we know who already practice vassalage in dating. Then, in the ceremony of vassal cattle certification, known as marriage, and even after marriage, the vows need to be reinforced and demonstrated every day. Imagine 12th century Europe as a grand theatrical performance, staging the themes of chivalric love, so popular that its actors would go on to serve as role models for people around the world, even 800 years later. So we have the following rules. Ladies of the court, who are the feminists? Today's feminists refer to the ladies of the court at the end of the Middle Ages as the first feminists, or proto-feminists, and like modern feminists, these women enjoyed considerable privilege and resources. From the 12th to the 14th century, evidence shows that women began to push for greater authority over how men and women should conduct their relationships, with a special emphasis on what they considered acceptable roles for men in a civilized and dignified society. It's no surprise that this was precisely the time when powerful women were able to establish courts of love, led by women who acted in a way similar to today's family courts, arbitrating disputes of love between couples in conflict. The key literature of the period, which detailed the proper etiquette expected in gender relations, was commissioned by powerful women, for example, The Art of Courtly Love. And in some cases, it was written by women themselves, for example, the works of Christine de Pizan or Marie de France. The emerging discourse acted like a drug that promised to introduce unilateral power for women over men. The spread of Romantic literature promised to quickly reach all social classes across the continent. We've been living with the consequences since then of a revolution far more significant for the history of gender relations than the introduction of birth control pills and divorce, without guilt, since the latter are merely accidental products generated within a larger culture of chivalric love. The archetypes introduced into society by these high-born ladies are instantly recognizable. The damsel in distress. They're innocent women, helpless women, women as victims. The princesses are the most beautiful women, women as narcissistic subjects, demanding devotion, women deserving of special privileges. And the high-born ladies, women who are morally pure, women as precious as jewels, women as superior, women as holders of status. And these illusions ensured that men's attention would be devoted to women, a program so successful that modern feminists continue to shape today's cultural landscape with the propaganda of their foremothers, proto-feminists. And just like their predecessors, women continue to use constraining narratives to facilitate their pedestalized inheritance. White knights. This metaphor refers to such heroic individuals, men who are chivalrous in many ways, but mostly in all the wrong ones, like showing off to women while taking pleasure and competing with and hurting other men. More than any other player in this act, white knights specialize in gallant behavior, all with the goal of impressing. And finally, goodbye, getting their egos stroked by women. For these early white knights, the tournament, the precursor to modern sports tournaments, consisted of chivalric competitions or battles in the Middle Ages. In these battles, knights were willing to hurt their peers just to win the praise of the women watching. The competitors were watched by women who would throw pieces of their clothing into the arena so that the athletes would wear a particular woman's item and represent her in the arena. The men were basically fighting for her, just like they did elsewhere on real battlefields. The gallant man who won his tournament would be granted an opportunity to have some fun with the woman he represented in the ring. We still keep this gynocentric tradition alive today with things like soccer tournaments, martial arts competitions, and so on, all designed to showcase male prowess, where the winning competitors get to have fun afterward with the best ladies. Other activities of white knights include impressing women with grand gestures of protection. For example, the Green Shield Initiative with the White Lady. It was a chivalric order founded by Jean Le Mingre and 12 other knights in 1399, pledging themselves for 5 years to the protection of women. Inspired by the ideal of courtly love, the stated goal of the order was to guard and defend the honor, property, possessions, reputation, fame, and praise of all ladies and maidens. An undertaking that was praised by Christine de Pizan. LeMay Gray, tired of receiving complaints from ladies, maidens, and widows who claimed they were being oppressed by powerful men, and finding no knight or squire willing to defend their just cause. He made a vow by writing a long letter in which he explained his purpose so that it would be widely spread throughout France and beyond its borders. The letter explained that any girl, young or old, who found herself a victim of injustice could request one or more knights for redress, and that knight would promptly respond and leave any other task he was doing to personally confront the lady's oppressor. The similarities between this order and contemporary initiatives, such as the White Ribbon Campaign, in which male ambassadors make vows to all women, never tolerate, excuse, or remain silent about violence against women, and intervene and take action against any man accused of a crime against a woman. Troubadours 1. POA's gaming proposed. The job of the troubadours was to spread the word about the virtues of chivalrous love through music, poetry, and storytelling. Both the aristocracy and the commoners enjoyed hearing stories of bravery, and the ladies, they were swept away by epic love poems, while the troubadours practiced the rituals of love, chivalrous. Just like today's PUAs or gamers, who write and speak in praise of the vagina, the troubadours were also composers and promoters of the art of love, seeking sexual fulfillment. They carry on the tradition of writing prose to illustrate the many ways to flatter women in order to get into their pants. Game is a very fitting word for this 800-year-old tradition, with its reliance on rehearsed lines and lack of personal authenticity. It's a scripted game of worshiping women, aimed at a narrow goal. In essence, this amounts to a pretense of chivalrous love for the purposes of manipulation, usually to gain sex. When modern women call these players real men, they may be very close to that mark. While they personally claim to reject chivalry, they nevertheless adopt its principles to achieve what they want. Troubadours, too. Men, feminists, or, unlike the aforementioned troubadours who advocated a love focused on sexual fulfillment, the troubadour, too, defended a more idealized love of desire that is not consummated in sexual intercourse. In essence, these men seemed more like Romeos, flatterers, than Casanova and Citado. The guiding concept for them was called pure love. These men were particularly prevalent in the north of France, while in the south we see the troubadours, Troubadours 1, celebrating a more carnal love, in which they sought complete sexual encounters. Another thing that distinguished Type 2 troubadours from the first was authenticity. These men seemed to fully identify with the role, and they weren't just players. The desire to serve women as a vassal or maybe even as a masochistic slave was part of their character. Think of today's version, like pro-feminist men who work servilely to spread the message of their feminist superiors, just as these troubadours devoted themselves to defending the narcissistic behavior of their ladies. The role of vassalage applies here more than to any other character from the Middle Ages, not as a merely pretentious routine to get sex, but actually as an affirmation of the soul. There are a lot of guys who are involuntarily celibate, not because of genetics, but because of their idealization of women, just like those Type 2 troubadours had. Evidence of gynocentrism can be found even before the Middle Ages, so gynocentrism would be about 800 years old. But to determine if the thesis is valid, first we need to define what gynocentrism is. The term gynocentrism has been in circulation since the 1800s, with the general definition being focused on women, concerned with women. Adam Kostalski further classifies gynocentrism as, quote-unquote, male sacrifice for the benefit of women and men's deference to women. And he concludes, gynocentrism, whether under the name of honor, nobility, chivalry, or feminism, its essence has not changed. It remains a peculiarly male duty to help women into the lifeboats, while the men themselves face a certain and icy death. End quote. From these definitions, we see that gynocentrism could refer to any woman-centered practice in a society, or even to a single gynocentric act carried out by an individual. With this broad usage in mind, we conclude that the term gynocentric culture is defined as any culture that institutes rules for gender relations that benefit women at the expense of men across a wide range of measures. At the core of our current form of gynocentrism is the practice of male sacrifice imposed for the benefit of women. If we accept this definition, we need to look back and ask the following question about whether the sacrifices made by men throughout history were always for the good of women, or alternatively, whether they were for some other primary purpose. For example, when men went off to die in large numbers in wars, was it for women, or was it for the man, the king, and the country? If it was for women, then we can say that this was the result of an intentionally gynocentric culture. If the sacrifice is not intended for the benefit of women, even if women are occasionally beneficiaries of male sacrifice, then we're not dealing with gynocentrism. Male disposability, strictly for the benefit of women, really took hold after the advent of the gender revolution of the 12th century in Europe. A revolution that gave us terms like bravery, chivalry, love, chivalrous, courtesy, romance, and so on. From that period on, gynocentric practices grew exponentially, culminating in the demands of today's feminism. In short, gynocentrism was at best a sporadic phenomenon before the Middle Ages, after which it became ubiquitous. With all this in mind, it makes little sense to talk about a gynocentric culture starting from the Industrial Revolution just 200 years ago, or 100 or 30 years ago, or to claim it's 2 million years old, as some would argue. We're not simply dealing with 2 million years of genetic programming. Our enemy, which is culturally constructed, is much, much easier to identify, and the historical evidence is strong. For me, I'm done with this society. I've already walked away from the negotiating table, but I still believe there are many men out there with potential who can be reached with the MGTOW message. I'm not a men's rights activist. I really support the guys in the movement, but I don't think having the same rights as women would solve anything, much less trying to stop the advance of feminist laws, because that's just not going to happen. The right answer to this equation is to go your own way. It's the best choice, and honestly, it's the only choice. If we ever have a chance to reverse the damage caused by centuries of gynocentrism, it's only through the message of the free man, one man at a time. Like in that movie with Andrew Garfield, Hacksaw Ridge. That's my job here, to help prevent an epidemic of men taking their own lives or losing their sanity because of an illusion called marriage and the narcissism of the modern woman. I believe that up to this point, I've achieved my goal. So let's review everything I've talked about so far. The gynocentric culture complex begins first by identifying a pathological complacency of men toward women, which I call indulgence. This indulgence is a psychological trait of men who give in to women's desires and wishes. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had the resources or survived the process of natural selection. It's a mechanism that nature developed to compensate for the sexual dimorphism between males and females in the human species. However, with the rise of civilized man, these psychological aspects become more dangerous, being wrongly justified as a presumption of female vulnerability by feminism, or as female hypermorality by traditionalism, by hypergamous fetishism, cuckoldry, chivalry, white knight syndrome, and so on, among others already mentioned. Collapse is the fate of all civilizations, and this is not a theory but a fact. We can tell that we are close to collapse when we notice social degeneration or the disregard for the values that were the foundation of that civilization. After the collapse of a civilization, another one forms, with weaker values than its predecessor because it inherits far more of the weaknesses since they are chronologically closer. People give in to indulgence, but now this is encouraged and reinforced by the prevailing culture, which starts with the practices of the aristocracy, and concepts like virtus and arete, which defined what it meant to be a real man, a virile man in ancient societies, were replaced by the delicacy and emasculation of courtly love. In this way, male dominance would be replaced by another purpose, an external validation, a divine and mortal love, his lady. Due to economic growth and a transition to a monetary system, there was a rural exodus, and people began to crowd into urban centers, making it easier for the epidemic spread of gynocentric idealism. The women of the high table of the aristocracy wanted a cultural reform in male-female relations. So they began to fund troubadours, writers, minstrels, and theatrical plays to quickly spread the idea of romantic love. Women from the highest to the lowest classes were captivated by this and began to demand such behavior from men. All of them were expected to be like Sir Lancelot, kind, gentle, and courteous to the ladies. The strategy was simple: create the ideal model of a domesticated man, convince women that they should demand men to be like that, just like in the stories, using the excuse that this would make access to reproduction easier. And with this scenario set, they began to question gender roles and talk about the oppression of women by men. This led to courtly love being introduced into the code of conduct for chivalry, giving rise to chivalry itself and, in this way, training men. They eliminated all masculine forms of entertainment, replacing them with things that were more in line with women's preferences. That's how tournaments and gynocentric sports came about, which I personally like to call bun fights or magina rodeos. A cultural revolution can't happen without the support of religion, and paganism, brought in by Eastern immigrants, especially one in particular, an Arab cult of feminism, was gradually absorbed by the clergy, resulting in Marianism, or the cult of the Virgin, which had as its earthly counterpart the cult of the lady, elevating women to the status of sainthood. Eleanor and her daughter Marie created the court of love, made up exclusively of women to judge marital cases and punish men. It was the feminist justice of that era. And that's it. These are the general factors that create a gynocentric cultural complex. On the timeline, next we see the debate about the status of women, female writers, feminists, and everything was getting ready to be absorbed by Marxism with the class struggle. In the bourgeoisie, the suffragettes emerged, the very same ones who... Neoconservatives love to gloss over this, but they had the exact same mentality as the women of the feudal aristocracy. Everything unfolds toward the second and third waves of feminism. Social justice warriors also appear, and we arrive at the present day. I hope it's clear what the roots of our problem today are, which is gynocentrism, and the reasons why MGTOW rejects traditional gender roles. We're seeing the history of the 12th century repeat itself. People crowding into big cities, the emergence of new technologies, economic growth, globalization, immigration, influence from other cultures, the advance of gynocentrism, and behavioral degeneration. The same thing happened during the Industrial Revolution, the same thing happened during World War II, and the same thing has been happening up to the present day. Patriarchy died at the height of ancient Greece and Rome. And after that, masculine values were completely relativized, with a man only being considered a man if he sacrificed himself for a woman. Now we are moving rapidly toward a transition of ages into the technocratic era, or whatever name the survivors will give it in the 100 or 200 years, and we'll see how far weak men, that is, men without values, or who base their values on gynocentric social validation, will get. That was everything I needed to say to you today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to share this video, to comment, and to share it on all your social media and groups, because that really helps boost this video's relevance. If you thought it was important, it needs to be relevant so that other people can be reached. And that's it for today. See you next time, strangers.